Well, hello, all you beautiful people, and welcome to another episode of the Places We'll Go show with your hosts, Richie and Mark. Now, look, today we have another amazing guest for you on the show who is none other than Paul Frampton. And now, Paul's reputation really is second to none in the marketing industry. And he himself, I would say, is a bit of a marketing influencer and a thought leader, especially when you look at his Instagram page and see that he's a part time DJ and spends most of his time in Ibiza. Or that's what it portrays anyway. I'm a bit jealous, I have to say, Paul. But in fact, look, he is a proud feminist and he really campaigns for greater accountability among men to look after women's safety and security, among many other things in that area. And for the role that he's played, he's been included as Management Today's 30 Male Agents of Change power list, which is actually really admirable, Paul. And I'm sure we're going to dig into that a little bit deeper as we go into this podcast this morning or evening or night, wherever you're listening into. He's also had a very illustrious professional career and currently is the president of marketing for Control and Exposed, which advises brands on media operating models, MarTech, data strategy, and right housing. Now, prior to this, Paul was an agency heavyweight, you could say. He led the Havas Group in the UK and Ireland and was also the CEO for the EMEA region for a disruptive travel brand called High Inc. Paul was voted Disruptive Tech and Marketing Leader of the Year by MadFest and MediaTel and was listed on the top 100 European B2B marketing leaders by Hot Topics as well. Now, Paul is in strong competition with our podcast, only because he runs his own Time for a Reset, which I do really highly recommend as well. He's got phenomenal guests on, just like ourselves. So look, with that note, Paul, what a pleasure to have you with us to talk about your journey, the ups and downs, the undulations, and the rounds and rounds. I'm going to hand over to Mark for the first question.
Thank you, Richie, and welcome, Paul. Great to have you on. So many accolades. We're truly privileged to have you on, and a wealth of experience that will be interesting for Richie and I, but hopefully very valuable and useful for our listeners as well. So let's get ourselves started. We were just talking before about what this Omicron variant might be.
Yeah.
So let's sort of skip through that and think about, well, hopefully at some point things are going to start to get better. So what have been the things that you're sort of looking to shed as we go into 2022, and what are you excited for 2022?
So firstly, thank you for having me. I'm a fan of the podcast, and thank you for such a nice intro, Richie. So, I mean, my brain is really driven by kind of what is coming next, and hence why I talk about Time for a Reset. And I find I've just actually done a behavioral economics course virtually with Chicago Booth University, the business school in the US, and I've learned all of the biases that I have and all of the biases that we all have, like projection bias, that a lot of people think that everything will continue to look like it looks at this precise moment in time, or recency bias, that you remember the last thing you read and that's the most important thing that you need to do tomorrow in marketing. So I think somewhere between all of this is a need to recognize the trends and what's actually kind of changing in kind of consumer behavior in, I guess, society, and in the way that people consume and interact with brands, whether they're media brands, which brands use to kind of portray their own brands, or whether they're brands that actually they buy from. So I think everyone's said it, but I think the last couple of years have obviously been a huge acceleration in that change. People's behavior has dramatically changed. I mean, never more so than how we work, right? And I don't think any of us could have imagined that the majority of the global workforce would suddenly be catapulted into working from home. And that has changed our mindset about so many things: the balance in our lives, how important it is to spend time with our family, the things we want to spend our money on, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, I've always got a curiosity about things that are changing, but also I think it's really important for us to discuss them and then kind of interrogate how important those things are in relation to what we're doing, because you can get a little bit dragged by a big shiny thing. It's really about the context of how does that affect what you're doing or what your business is doing. And then from what I've learned in the last few months, I think it's about kind of introspecting our own biases to make sure that we're not kind of just going with a digital bias or a traditional marketing bias or a unconscious bias of targeting people that look like us. So yeah, that's what's in my head on this Friday morning.
Well, Paul, I'm not going to go easy on you on this, and I'm going to hit you with another question in this area, really. But So you talk about bias, and I love that notion. And in fact, all of us, have these biases that we bring, and recency is a great one to pick at. But let me ask you this. So what do you think have been the biases that you have had that has held you back in your career?
Great question. You didn't prepare me for this one, Richie. So thank you for that.
That's what we tried to do.
No, all the best podcasts don't have prepared questions. So I would actually say, I don't know what I would call this bias, but I would say that the thing that clouded my career for a while was I've always been very results orientated. So for me, I always needed to be succeeding, moving up, achieving things. And I think that became so important to me. And I'm pretty sure I'm not the only person in the ad marketing industry to have this bias, that your ego starts to drive a lot of your kind of decisioning around things. And suddenly, when I decided to leave Havas at the end of 2017, I was in this moment where I had a lot of time to, I guess, ponder and think about my next step. And I talked to lots of people and I had lots of interesting conversations, but I think what was driving me was what's the next big thing that I need to do that everyone's going to go, Paul went from Havas here. And then I started to talk to some of my mates, some of whom are in the industry, about a couple of opportunities. And one of them is actually where I am now, which the company was a US company. No one had ever heard of it, but it ticked every other box. It ticked that I love the culture, I love the values, I have autonomy, it's disruptive, it's in an area that I care about. And they said, well, why does it matter what the logo is above the door and what the press release says? And I suddenly realized that my bias was that I assumed in my own head, and the other thing I'm doing a lot of at the moment is meditation and trying to connect with my brain and work out what's my thought versus my consciousness, to separate those two things. I realized that I was biasing myself about what I do and just putting too much of a focus on how I was perceived by other people.
Paul, can I just jump in there for 1 second? I love that, by the way, and I struggle with that a lot myself. And what I guess in some ways trying to kind of get that balance of, like you say, a logo behind the door and perception of the outside world versus perception of yourself is just something I think a lot of us struggle with in the marketing world, the constant need for affirmation from others that we're on the right path and doing the right things. But what I do love is when I see your posts on Instagram, you talk about autonomy, the ability for you to kind of work from anywhere. You really do live and breathe your family, and you also have a lot of outside passion for music. I really do love that culmination of things, and it really does feel like you've got a great balance in that sense. So,
well, I mean, I don't think any of us has a perfect balance, right? But one thing actually I'm part of, which I'll share, which has helped me, is there's a guy called Ben McKay who runs a group called Mende, which is some senior men in the industry that get together to talk about stuff that men don't talk about. And we started it around careers, relationships, but it's gone into all sorts of areas about confidence and divorce and sex and all sorts of things. It's the type of stuff that men don't talk about. Men talk about all the things that we know we've got a bias for, right? And we talk about in the pub or on a golf course or in a boardroom. And in those forums, I learned that actually you've got to kind of constantly reassess where you focus your time and how you fill your, what he calls your container. You've only got one container. You can't keep filling it because it'll overflow. And if it's overfilled with work, or it's overfilled with kind of one passion and that's affecting work, and you're not spending time with your family. So I do try to keep a focus on balance, but I like pace. I like things moving fast, which is another one of my issues and my bias. So I tend to get caught up in work and interesting things and supporting lots of extracurricular things. Yeah. And then I have to stop myself, or my wife stops me and says, why have you agreed to do another chair thing or another NED thing? Because you said you didn't have time to do the other ones and you're not going to be here. but I know you guys both do similar things, that you help out. I mean, Mark, you're helping out with this to help other kind of young marketeers learn. And Richie, you've built a business to help young people, right? So we all want to help, but I think sometimes you have to also be a little bit selfish about how do you make sure you give to yourself and to the people that you care most around you first, and then to the wider community.
That's brilliant, Paul. I mean, I've probably got about 50 questions already just from what you said. So I'm just going to work really hard to think about what to say now. Just on biases, I think what you were just talking about is actually called the Ben Franklin effect, which is that we like doing favors, and we're more likely to do another favor for someone if we've already done them a favor before. So there's a sort of an iterative effect, but of course, at some point you just get overloaded. So that is definitely a thing. Now, we can talk about feminism, we can talk about balance, but I just want to take a little step back. You basically said I'm unmotivated by what's next, and that innate curiosity. You also talked about achievement orientation. So I'm just interested, why do you think you were wired how you were wired?
Great question. So I think it probably stems back, as most things do, to my childhood. I was brought up by two head teachers. My dad was the head teacher of a grammar school, very, very good grammar school, and my mum was the head teacher of a primary school. And a couple of things that were really important about that I reflected on. One, I had equal role models. My mum and my dad were equally successful. They both went to each other's events on the same evening. They would go and be there for each other, and then they would switch and go to others. So from my perspective, I never saw any difference between the role model that my mum was as a leader versus the role model my dad was. So that definitely helped me to understand the gender equality issue, which I know wasn't your question, but I think it's worth saying. The second point was, obviously, with two head teachers as parents, and one in a grammar school where that grammar school was taking the top X% of students, I was pushed to achieve, both academically, kind of from a sporting perspective, and from an extracurricular perspective. So I feel like that helped me, but it also did, it has created this inner kind of results orientation around me to never be satisfied. And never being satisfied is a good thing, right? I mean, I guess it leads to why Cristiano Ronaldo does what he does last night on a football pitch at the age of 36 and like doesn't give up. But it also can create quite a weight on you when you're constantly thinking about, have I got to where I need to be yet?
Yeah, I just got to follow up there. Richie, sorry to come in. I met Johnny Wilkinson way back when. He's a hero of mine. He won the 2003 Rugby World Cup.
Yeah.
And the obvious question was, what did it feel like to win the Rugby World Cup? And the answer was quite surprising. He said I didn't feel anything. I felt quite empty, quite hollow. And again, it was an extreme of achievement orientation that meant he hadn't learned how to enjoy it. And then he obviously has talked about his mental health issues and learned how to enjoy the moment and became almost obsessive about enjoying the moment. But nonetheless, how do you encourage yourself, force yourself, remind yourself to enjoy it along the way?
Another great question, Mark. And one actually I've sat with quite a lot for the last couple of weeks, because the business I'm running, I started it from scratch, right? I went from having lots of people to literally having nobody working for me and starting a business. And in 2 years, we've achieved a lot. But the problem is, because I'm always thinking about next, once I get there, I'm like, oh, it's not enough. And I'm having to force myself to stop in the moment. And this is where some of the meditation is happening, which does encourage you to live in the moment and just kind of stop all the noise and all of the stuff that's in your brain and just focus on what's actually kind of happening in your body, like the sensations in your body, the noises and everything, and just live in the moment. And the irony is, I mean, you mentioned Ibiza, Richie. I would say my happy place where I totally disconnect is the minute I get off a plane in Ibiza. I actually kind of lose my phone, which is not unheard of for me. And I've created it almost as like this sacred place. We're very fortunate to have a place there. And once I get to that place with the sun and the music and everything else, and I get my decks out, I find it actually difficult to connect with work. And occasionally I've done work there and I've actually stopped myself and said, this is going to ruin my sacred place if I do this. I'll only do a certain amount of it. But I would say just in a normal week, I actually have to catch myself and just stop and go, almost say to myself, remember, this is an achievement and you should dwell on it for a second. I actually literally will say those words out to myself sometimes, because it's a bit like affirmations, positive affirmations. Once you say them, it affects your brain. And cognitively, that changes the way your brain processes. So I'm trying to learn those things. I don't think I was built for it. my boss, Jay in the US, told me about this meditation app, which is a very sophisticated app that is trying to help you separate your thoughts and your consciousness so that you can look at yourself without being in your thought. And the first time I heard that was like, I don't even really know what that means. And I'm struggling with it. I'm only 10, 11 weeks into that, 10, 11 days into it. But I'm beginning to see that what he says is we are what we think, and what we think defines us. And if we don't get control of that, that can create obviously mental health problems, but also imbalance in the way we are and how we show up every day.
You know, Paul, it's super interesting that you talk around meditation. And in fact, my in-laws are very big into this and totally encouraging me to kind of get into this in a bigger way. So I can relate. What's the app called, by the way, for anyone listening in?
Good question. 1 second. It is called Waking Up.
Waking Up.
So there's a 7-day free trial, and then it's £99. So, and I think the bias we have about apps is you think, well, I'm only going to buy a free app. I'm not going to pay for it, but genuinely it's worth paying for because the content is very different to what you'll get from a free meditation app.
Hey, there you go. So you heard it here first, guys. Meditation is absolutely key. And actually, it's one of my Christmas goals to try and start to get a little bit into it. Mark has got his own sort of ways of unwinding, the Wim Hof Method.
Let me do 30 seconds on that, Richie.
Go.
I don't know if you've heard of it, Paul. Wim Hof, he's the Iceman, the Dutch guy, 60 years old, 25 records for various sort of survival feats, running marathons on Everest with just shorts on, running marathons in the desert with no water and extreme cold survival. So I'm doing that, and it involves an ice baths, which I do every morning, about 3 degrees, and sort of an active meditation technique around breathing. But what you said is very resonant in terms of it lifts the noise.
How do you create an ice bath every morning?
Well, you buy one off and fill up with water, and then lob big chunks of ice in every so often. Right. At the moment, it's sort of quite self-regulating. So yeah, it's not in the. I don't sort of run a bath every morning, but it's there. It's it's a bit like a hot tub, but much lower on.
But the opposite, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. No. So I mean, that point about restoration is super fascinating. I love this thought of a sacred place. Were you searching for that, or did it just happen?
No, I think it kind of just happened, but my wife and I always found when we went there, and it isn't just the music, right? We're not hardcore kind of up till 4 a.m. every night kind of partying type of people. I'm far too old for that, but we do like clubbing. It's something more about, and I don't know if either of you have spent much time in Ibiza. It has a reputation, like many countries, for one thing, but it has a lot of depth to it. I mean, in actual fact, the island is very focused on mindfulness and yoga and kind of lots of other things. Apart from, it's almost like the antithesis of kind of clubbing, falling asleep in a gutter. But Ibiza, there's something about the energy on the island. And again, I've always struggled with some of these hippie-ish concepts. My wife's Latin, she's from Colombia, and she often tells me to get more in connection with these things. I struggle with them, but I do feel something different when I'm there. The energy in certain places, and I just know that my body decompresses and relaxes for some reason. So I don't know why, but I've obviously taught my brain, or something there helps my brain to relax.
I tell you, I've been to Ibiza a few times now, and I get absolutely the same sense as you've just articulated. I'm by no means a clubbing kind of guy anymore, and I really do say I could totally relate to that energy that you feel and you sense. So, guys, just to recap here: so meditation, finding your happy place, and jumping in ice cold baths. Here, you heard it here first. That's the killer combination for relaxation. But Paul, I want to come back to the fact that, as you talked about with Control and Expose, very, very different environment, operating environment to what you're used to, right. Big heavyweight corporate agency land in effect. How have you coped with that? I mean, was that a struggle to get down to, nuts and bolts, building from scratch versus, all the infrastructure processes in place like the likes of Havas? Yeah.
So I think by the time when I left Havas, I was a little exhausted, if I'm honest. I was my goal was the pursuit of getting to the top of an organization so that I could define the culture and the strategy. And actually, there's a story there actually about where I started, if you want to go there, but I won't go there now. And I found myself just doing things that were sucking the life out of me on a train to the Eurostar, just, yeah, I'll be honest, like arguing over EBITDA targets and not really talking about building capability and kind of serving customers. And like my passion has always been kind of serving customers and developing value proposition and product that delivers against the needs of a client going forward. And yeah, there were various different initiatives that I drove up, some of which were very successful and I was backed for, but there were some that I just felt needed to be delivered. And I found, not just in Havas, but just holding groups per se, there was a slowness to move towards what was needed because of the attachment to a previous operating and commercial model. And that just frustrated me. So I think I was actually, whilst I had lots of people working for me and I was able to do a lot of the things that I love, vision, strategy, culture, all of that kind of thing, I actually wasn't really energized every day coming into work. So I actually felt like letting go of that actually helped me to be more energized. So ironically, I felt better moving into my next role. And I went and did, as you said, a technology startup thing, very different, deliberately, because I wanted to shift and change my CV. I'd been at Havas forever. Yep. Which a lot of people will look at your CV and go, well, why have you done that? I mean, to be fair, I did move up the whole time I was there, but I still worked in one organization. And I looked at myself and said, that's not a good enough frame of reference. You need to go and do something else. And I thought I must go and do something else radically different. So I went into a business that had 10 people with real technology, real product, a marketing team, a sales team. And that taught me a lot, actually. It taught me about how marketers look at agencies, because I had people coming to me and going, we want to spend this much money to do this. And I'm like, why? And how is this going to benefit the P&L and all of these kind of things? But I also learned what building a business was like scaling up, hiring those first 10 people. I listened to the Masters of Scale podcast, and I think in it, they always talk about hire A-class talent. Every single person on your team needs to be A-class talent. And I think that's true of every company. But in a startup, it has to be true. I mean, you know this, Richie, because you can only hire so many people. If you hire someone that isn't really engaged, then you have a struggle. So I learned there how to build businesses from small, and I was able to build a culture. The challenge I had was I built a culture in London, and it was an Asian organization with Chinese backers, SoftBank, Foxconn, Japanese, Chinese backers, and a Chinese founder. And they didn't really like the fact that I built a culture that was very customer and people centric, because the Chinese don't really, let's be honest, care about that. They care about delivery and numbers. So I then found I had this new struggle where I thought I'd built the right business, but I was in friction with the HQ because people were leaving Hong Kong to come and join the London team, which I thought, well, that's a good thing, isn't it? But of course it isn't a good thing, because it makes that my leadership be questioned about my allegiance to the center of the business. Now, one good example, I mean, it was a hospitality business. So we were selling technology to 5-star hotels so that they had smartphones in the room so that they could track what customers were doing around and about the town. But the customer got free smartphone, free data, which at that point mattered because it was roaming charges, but also content and curation around what to do in a city. So if you went to Tokyo, you would have a phone in English as a Brit or an American that told you what to do. And the hotel was able to push to the phone, like offers and things that you could do. So it was a really smart proposition. It just had some challenges, like many startups, about chasing numbers that weren't revenue. So we were just chasing the number of rooms, but we weren't thinking about enough, how does that convert to revenue? Anyway, so I learned a lot there. And then when I was approached for this role, it was a US marketing services company that I knew nothing of. And they said, quite rightly, you've run a big company. Are you really going to be the first person on the ground? Are you capable of actually knocking on doors and doing everything? And I was like, I actually feel like quite excited about that proposition, right? I'm sure at a point I'm going to get frustrated if I haven't got to a certain point and started to develop it. But I think what I did was I set myself a goal for the first 6 months only that I would act a certain way and do certain things, and then I would reassess where I was and start to change it a little bit. Anyway, I'm gonna pause because I'm talking too much.
Fascinating journey, and the scale of organization is such a big determinant in terms of what your existence is like. I'm just going to bank the point you made about hiring A-class people. Hire people better than you. You're only as good as the strength of your team. You might guess the question I'm going to ask, because it's the question you sort of said, I'll answer that later, or something to that effect. Yeah. You talked about how you got in, why you wanted to get to the top. I don't know exactly what the question was, but you know what it was. So what were you edging into there?
So I at university I did English lit, and I've always been fascinated with words and kind of writing, and I write a lot, and I've always enjoyed that. And so my first instinct was to go and be a journalist. And I started on an NUJ course, and then a few months into it, I just had a bit of a wobble as I started to think, is this the right career trajectory for me? Would I ever really be able to get to being one of the few journalists that's actually really successful and really well known? And so then I started to look around in what I termed in my head media. So I picked up the Guardian media section and looked at it and started looking at, and for me that meant working for someone like the BBC, right? That's what I thought it meant. And I found this little 1-by-1 ad for some business called OMD. And I was like, no idea what that is, but they're hiring for graduates. I'll apply to it. I turned up for an interview with Tim McCluskey, who's fairly renowned in the industry, sat on his desk, sat with his feet on his desk, smoking a fag, who interviewed me. And I was like, interesting, this is very Mad Men. I don't think Mad Men was out at that point, but I can say it now. And I thought, and I didn't get that job, but he told me to go to another 3-letter acronym agency, MPG, which was the kind of predecessor of Havas. And I went there and I did a grad interview with a number of other people, like a panel interview. And I don't think I did particularly well, but they asked me one question, which was, what's a TVR? And I had no idea, obviously being a graduate. So I kind of thought, this is a situation where actually trying to bring humor in and being a little cheeky might actually work. So I flipped it and just said, it's a British sports car that I'd love to own once I'm successful in your company. And they liked it, and they went, we like you, we like your attitude, we're going to give you a job. But anyway, a year in, I hated it. I was at the bottom of the bottom, obviously, and I was just doing competitive filling in Excel sheets. And there was a really masculine, fear-driven culture, buying culture. Like the phones were slammed down once you'd been on the phone to the Daily Mail. And I was quite a meek little kind of just turned 20, 21, had been brought up with 2 head teachers, very Catholic family, done an English lit degree, been around many more women than men. And I was like, I'm not sure this place is for me. And I almost left because I spoke to my mum and dad and I said, maybe I should go into teaching, which is what you always told me I should do because it's more vocational. And then I looked in the mirror, not literally, but I looked in the mirror. I was like, why are you giving up? You shouldn't give up yet. Like what you should try and do is actually think about how to change this in yourself and try and make it. And I set myself like the target of going, why don't I just keep pushing and see if I can get a little bit further up to do something slightly different. And I knew nothing about the word purpose. So I'm not going to claim that I knew my purpose, but I set myself almost like a goal of getting into some kind of role that would help me to shape the culture because I didn't like the culture. And I thought, I wonder if I could get into it where maybe if I'm on a little committee that kind of feeds this stuff in, that people will start to listen. And that became my target for the next 20 years, basically. Because every time I got to the next level, I was like, I haven't got enough influence. I need to keep pushing further and further. And then, of course, I got to the top and I was definitely able to shape the culture within Havas in the UK. But I realized that there was a culture that came from outside of the UK that was the culture because Havas is French. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that culture, but I realized that target, I'd kind of got to where I wanted to get to and I'd achieved what I wanted to get to. But yeah, I just tell the story because I think it's quite an interesting lesson there for people in terms of when you're not enjoying something, are you clear on your longer term goal? And you don't need to know what it is, but are you clear on why you're doing something? And I often say to people I'm mentoring to think about the ikigai Japanese thing about, you guys probably know, like what are you good at? What can you get paid at? What does the world need? And what's the last one? Richie, help me.
Passionate about?
What are you
So,
passionate about?
passionate about.
Yeah.
Yeah. There you go, Paul. Look, I love that story, and particularly around the motivation to go to the next rung, which perhaps is far more, far more emotive than simply saying I want more money or I want more whatever, intrinsic ego-driven stuff. You actually had a much higher purpose there, and I think that's really held you in good stead and held you to get to that success. I want to clearly pick up on the point that you talked about around culture, which really encapsulates your personality and the way you're trying to drive forward, which I guess is sort of motivation for the fact that you're a proud feminist, and the role that you play in that space. And I'd like to kind of hear a little bit more about the kind of things or the motivations behind it and what you're currently doing.
Sure. So I think I just have an intrinsic uncomfortableness, is it, with unfairness. It riles me when I see unfairness, and I suppose when I as I said, I grew up in a culture where I had equal role models, spent more time with women in English, doing an English lit degree, have a lot of female friends, etc., etc. So I was listening a lot to the female perspective early on in my life. And I was also could see for myself that in the company I was in, all the people that were running it were all white men, and they were the ones with the loudest voices. And it wasn't just that there wasn't equality or opportunity. It was that the women were expected to behave like the men to get on in a media agency. Like they had to get the banter. They had to be able to be slightly aggressive and adversarial. They had to turn up, not in a power suit, but dressed in a certain way, as opposed to being able to just dress how they wanted to. And I was like, it's really weird. Like, why is that the case? And I mean, I didn't know this now, but I've studied it. And there's a thing called hegemonic masculinity, which is basically the kind of the word that's used to describe why men constantly go back to ratify their dominance in society. And whether it's outright for certain people that we know that are very misogynistic, or it's just subtle things that men do to reaffirm that they are legitimized as the most important gender and they are in control, that those things happen every day, everywhere. So in trying to deal with unfairness, I think gender was the one that, given 50% of the globe pretty much is female, I thought would be the one that I should take on first. And I realized the first thing I could do, because I built a fairly successful voice and personal brand, was to use that to speak out, because most people I noticed didn't speak out. And most men, even today, most men hide when there's an issue around gender equality or women's safety or violence against women. Most men hide in the shadows, or when they come into the conversation, they come into it in a very defensive mode. So the latest thing I've done is after the horrific Sarah Everard case, which, by the way, all it was something that got huge media attention. There's been 100 other murders this year that haven't got anywhere near the same coverage. Most of them, and the ones that weren't white, have been squashed by the media, which is a whole other issue, but linked. So I created this thing called Yes All Men, where I get men together to have a conversation about this. I often get women in a a closed group Zoom meeting or WhatsApp group to talk about like how women really feel. And the thing that really hit me and hit most of the men that were in that is the first session we did, everyone suddenly walked out of it and realized every woman feels scared walking down the street, right? Every woman pretty much holds their keys with the key like out ready just in case, or every woman crosses the road if they see a man on a dark road. It's not like a small community of women, it's all of them. It's just some are more vocal, and these things are not talked about, right? And a lot of it comes down to some of the issues that men have with dealing with their own masculinity and being open and kind of dealing with their feelings and emotions and being able to talk about stuff without it affecting their ego or whatever else. But I just feel like there aren't enough men that bang this drum. So I decided that I should apportion some of my time to trying to change that. And my wife, who's obviously a woman, admires it, but also says to me, "Aren't you taking on another thing that's too big?"
Brilliant. If you want something done, give it to a busy person. I love the activism. Paul, that you don't just sit on the sidelines or hide in the shadows. Indeed, as you described. Yes, all men sounds fascinating. I was actually fortunate enough to be at an NSPCC fundraising dinner last night, where a lady recalled her horrific life story, and I was sat next to our chief risk officer, and he was saying, why is it that men are behind all the bad things in the world? We really need to get together to talk about masculinity. I mean, you couldn't make it up. This is exactly what you've just been saying. You did mention there about you've been able to leverage your personal brand. It's something we talk about on the show because we're in marketing after all, and building a personal brand is a thing. So what's your take on how you build a personal brand?
So the first step, if I'm kind of thinking about those people listening about what they should do, is sit down with a piece of paper and work out what the things that you care about most are. I mean, I think from the conversation here, you probably get a sense of the things that I care about, but I guess my watermark, as I call it, for my personal brand was kind of disruption and change, diversity and leadership. Those are my three watermarks that I define my personal brand about. And by the way, I don't think I got that completely clear on that piece of paper right at the beginning. I probably got maybe the one around unfairness and the one around change and new things, because at the time I was quite junior in a media department and just moved into digital. And part of the reason I moved into what was called the online department earlier than most was my interest in what's new, and also quite unapologetically, because I saw less competition and less people that wanted to do it, right? I was like, I can stay in this traditional sphere where there's lots of people that have done it for years and there's lots of rules and it's defined how you do it, or I could jump into this new thing, bit of a risk, but opportunity to shape it and to develop kind of a space for myself. So once I was very clear on those three things, I then decided to think about the best way to get a voice. And back then, social media wasn't really such a thing as it is now, right? So I just decided to pick up the phone to various journalists, mainly in the media and digital space, and said, "Can I buy you lunch? I'd just like to meet you so that I know you, and if you've got things you want to ask, then you can call me." Now, I don't think many people do that. I think most people wait for a journalist to call them, and of course, journalists only call the people they know, because that's just the way they work. Most of them, that's not fair. They're not all lazy, but they go to their go-to people, right? Because they know where they've got good advice. So I started to do that, and then I offered to write things. I obviously liked writing, so I was finding one of my passion points in the Ikigai model. I was like, I want to write, so I've got to find a role for that in my role, and nobody's giving me it, so I need to go and find an outlet for it. So I started to write things. I realized that what journalists wanted was a provocative point of view, and provocative was probably my go-to rather than just a really kind of pedestrian answer. So I started to write, and then social media came along, and I realized Twitter was a great place. So I started to build my following on there. Once I got my following quite high there, I then switched to LinkedIn and thought I should do it on LinkedIn. Then I switched to Instagram. And yeah, I think I do it very intentionally. And I think if you have a personal brand, you have to be prolific. And prolific means you have to do it a lot, regularly, with frequency. I mean, some of these things are marketing like adages, right? And if you want to market yourself, then you need to know what you're marketing to who, and the messaging needs to be clear and consistent and with frequency. So I guess I applied a lot of what I learned as a planner, working on P&G and Dockers and Levi's back in the late 90s. I applied that to my own brand. And I think there's a reason why it's called personal brand, which is because you're trying to develop a brand, and therefore you need to think about many of the same things that you would think about for developing a brand. And actually some of the best brands out there, I think, have great leaders and visible personalities that actually anchor to that brand. So James Timson from Timson's on the High Street, I think, is a fantastic example of that, because he lives and breathes the brand. He gives opportunities to people that have been in prison. He talks openly during COVID about looking after his staff and not putting them on furlough, et cetera, et cetera. And I think modern leadership is about being there, being accessible, and having conversation with your customers, but also sharing in all the places you can with your talent, your customers, your future customers' talent, what it is you care about and your business cares about. To me, that's what personal brand's about.
I tell you what, Paul, what a super insightful answer and a real answer. Interestingly, back in 2016 when we first met, your parting words were, "Richie, you better get on social media." It really was, and actually, it really kind of fueled my enthusiasm for it. Therefore, and I always try and listen to take a piece of nugget of every conversation I have, and that was ours from those days, and hopefully done you a little bit proud on that respect.
Right, that's lovely to hear.
But Paul, I want to ask another question in relation to this, because I get asked this all the time and I'd love to get your point of view. A lot of people, when thinking about personal brands, really struggle, particularly if they've either got a portfolio career or whether they have a corporate job, for example. And to what extent do you think linking your personal brand to your corporate job, logo, whatever, versus you talked about 3 pillars, which are aside from that, what direction would you advise people go in that respect?
Incredibly insightful question, because I think this is the obstacle or the barrier that a lot of people have.
Yep.
And it's not without its challenges, right? I mean, I'll be honest, I got critiqued by certain senior people in Havas around the amount of time I put into investing in my personal brand.
Right.
And it was almost seen as, well, this seems to be too much of a distraction and it's taking you, and I took the opportunity then to then try and explain why actually this was the complete opposite, and how it had led to us having new business opportunities and hiring talent that we would never have hired. So I think the problem with personal at the front of brand is I think people see it as, oh, you're just doing this for yourself, building an ego, and your personal brand has to be able to be lent to the business that you work for, but still stay authentic to yourself, is the way I would suggest it should be. So it needs to be malleable enough that it's not irrelevant to the business you work for. And that comes back to picking the right job, right? That comes back to getting in the center of that Ikigai model. If you're working for a business that you have, where if your principles and what you care about are completely at odds with that business, then your personal brand is going to be at odds with the corporate brand. And that's where the problems come. So I would suggest that the people that maybe have that friction should possibly spend some time reflecting on whether they're in the right place. Because if you really believe in what you do and you care about it, then you should have the confidence to be able to shout about it externally. And I'm not suggesting everyone's going to be as confident as maybe I would be, or you are now, Richie, on social media, because certain people obviously have more introvert personalities, but there are ways to do it where you just, for instance, like you said, you have a conversation, you put a perspective out and then ask a question on LinkedIn. You don't need to write 500 words polished like you would for a blog or a dissertation. Social media is a community, and actually what fuels the community is conversation. So I think some people don't lean in because they think, I can't write brilliantly. But actually just be vulnerable in social media and kind of put stuff out there. And I think you'll find that you'll get more positivity than you will negativity. The only caveat I'd make to that is LinkedIn is one of the horrific places where there is a lot of bad masculine behavior. And I would encourage any men to call out the idiotic men that post on women's posts and just make misogynistic comments just because they feel like they know better. And so I'm not going to hide from the fact that there is that out there. But the more female voices that are out there that talk about vulnerability or the importance of culture, or during COVID, the importance of giving people time to disconnect, the better. Like I've seen a lot of the female CEOs in the agency world doing that. And I think it's had a really positive impact on the industry and the ad industry.
Great call to action, Paul, in terms of being an active ally, specifically in the LinkedIn space. You mentioned about being intentional. There's a word that sort of leapt out there. I just wanted to pause on that for a moment. You're very intentional, and I just wonder if to get intentional, is the work done in your head, or do you have a support network of mentors and advisors to help you to get as intentional as you are?
So I've definitely had a big support of mentor and advisors and coaches over the years. I'd say these days, most of it's now in my head. It's just my rhythm and my routine. It's just part of my DNA. And I'm very fortunate to have finally found a place where I feel I have all of the right kind of drivers and energizers that allow me to be myself. And I think the being myself piece is really important. So within Havas, I wanted to be myself, and I wanted to project some of those things about where I thought we should invest. And that was where I often would come up against friction. And I reflected on that and realized that that's not the company's fault. That's me. I have these beliefs, and I just need to pick the right place. But no, over the years, I've had incredible kind of mentors and coaches, and I'd encourage anybody early on or mid-level of their career, if not later on as well, to have multiple mentors, because I found that sometimes you need everyday role models when you're young, people that actually aren't kind of up here, somebody that you can look up to that's maybe one level above you, that you go, actually, you look and feel like I am, but a little bit further ahead. And then you also need mentors that are good at encouraging you in different areas. So maybe one of those is leadership and personal brand. Maybe one of those is just being good at the discipline that you've decided to work in. Maybe another one of those is work-life balance. Not every mentor is brilliant at all of those things, I found. And there is a massive difference between mentoring and coaching, which I think we know, but I think a lot of people still get confused. It's like how people get confused between objectives and strategy. Like you look at it, but how could people ever get confused? But people do, particularly in the marketing industry. And a mentor is there kind of working through scenarios, giving you kind of advice of how they would do it. A coach is helping you to think and introspect in yourself, to think about how to solve these things rather than giving you all the answers yourself. And that is that they are fundamentally different things.
Well, I'll tell you what, Paul, unfortunately, we've come to the end of the segment, but I think we could have talked for hours, to be honest with you. And it just brings such a lovely, fresh perspective to the party here. So I think, Mark, I'm going to hand over the baton to you to try and summarize a difficult job, to be fair, and hence why I hand over the baton, to try and summarize some of the key themes from Paul, if I may. But Paul, just a massive thank you from me. It's been awesome, as always. Every interaction I have with you, I just get so enthused and sort of learn so much from the experience. So thank you for taking the time out.
Look, it's been a very natural conversation, so I appreciate it.
Yeah. No, thank you for passing the baton, Richie. It's a privilege to do so, and thank you, Paul. So let's see what have we learned. So right out of the gate, we started to talk about feminism, misogyny. We haven't had that conversation so far, so thank you for bringing that perspective, Paul. And it dotted all the way through. Actually, it's clearly something that's very resonant, and I hadn't realised that in LinkedIn, that there is that behaviour. And something that actually we can all be an ally towards. So that was a big thing. But then we got into, what makes you tick in terms of your curiosity, your biases, and how you achieve a balance, but with pace. And then I was just really fascinated with the Ibiza conversation, the sacred place. Your eyes just sort of glinted a little bit when you talked about getting your decks out.
Yeah, I'm sure they did.
Getting your decks out is clearly sort of a moment where you lose yourself, and stopping the noise. What a wonderful thought. And I can see the influence of your parents in you in many ways. You wanted to get to the top, but remember Ikigai. What do you enjoy? What are you good at? What does the world need? And so on. TVR, brilliant. I mean, what a moment. It must take a lot out of that moment to then think I can be quite a bit of a clever clogs in a good way in a tricky moment. That must have been brilliant. We've talked about personal brand, disruption, change, diversity, and leadership, and it made me think that my summary of you, Paul, is very intentional, very deliberate, very cause-driven in all the right ways, from femininity to fairness to so on. And I think it's just really been a great pleasure to hear your personal insights. Some very different perspectives you've not heard before, and I think that very rich and valuable for that. So enormous thank you from Richie and myself, Paul, and also on behalf of everyone that will be tuning in. So thank you again.
Thank you, guys. Really enjoyed it.